Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's TIA live stream, Cargo Theft, the Chameleon Effect, How Evolving Crime Rings Target Today's Supply Chain. My name is Anthony, and I am the Senior Education Manager here at TIA, as well as the host of today's show. I'm joined by Mr. Scott Cornell, who will be introducing himself shortly. We do just have a few housekeeping items to get through, and then we will get right on to the discussion today. First up, we will go through the TIA antitrust statement. Discussion, comments, and presentations during TIA functions must not refer to any past, present, or future rates, prices, or anything related thereto. Include any reference to marketing strategies, include any discussion of boycotts of any person, product, or firm, or inhibit any members, employees from discussing employment with other member companies. Additionally, things you hear during the meeting that are confidential and private to TIA should not be shared publicly without its prior consent or used against or in competition with TIA. Next up, we have the option for you to submit your questions throughout the webinar, throughout the live stream today, and we would love to hear from you. Feel free to submit your questions in the comment section in the LinkedIn or YouTube event which you are currently watching this through, or if you would prefer to email your question, please send it over to education@tianet.org with the subject live stream, and after our discussion, we will get to your questions. Additionally, if you have any questions about TIA or TIA resources which might be brought up throughout the conversation today, please send an email to info@tianet.org. When you want to come back and review this recording, you can come back to the LinkedIn or YouTube event you are viewing from now as well. And you can also view past live streams by checking out the TIA LinkedIn account under the events and by going to the TIA YouTube channel. While you're on those accounts or that channel, be sure to follow TIA and make sure to check out tianet.org to check out the resources that we will be talking about and all of the TIA resources which we offer you, our members. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we will get into it now. Scott, would you like to provide a brief introduction, please?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Anthony. I always enjoy doing these with the TIA and trying to get the word out on what's going on with cargo theft. I am the Chief Risk Officer for SPG Specialty Innova and Logistic, and have a 30+ year background in supply chain security and cargo theft investigations. I serve on the TIA Cargo Theft Task Force under Dan O'Sullivan, and do a lot of different things with the TIA. So always happy to engage in these types of opportunities.
Thank you, Scott. We appreciate it. And we're going to set the stage here, Scott, with our first question. So can you set the scene by discussing how cargo theft evolved after 2020? What specifically changed about who is stealing, how they operate, and who they target?
Yeah, I know we talked, before we teed it up here that, in some ways this live stream comes from the article that I was asked to write for the TIA, which we called the Chameleon Effect, not to be confused with chameleon carriers, right? The Chameleon Effect refers more to the massive changes that we've seen across the industry and the way that the bad guys have been able to kind of almost get inside the house and operate from within, so to speak, and kind of blend in with the industry. So that all changed right around 2020. Prior to 2020, for many years of doing this, we were dealing primarily with these, small regional crews. They weren't very sophisticated. They did primarily straight theft. Strategic theft came to the United States, or we saw it really start to surface between 2010 and 2013. I actually remember speaking about it at J.J. Coghlan's Southwest Transportation Security Council sometime around 2013, saying, hey, this is going to be a problem in the future. But at the time, it was about 3% of all cargo theft, according to CargoNet numbers. And there were really two methods. There was identity theft and fictitious pickups. Identity theft targeted freight brokers, but fictitious pickups really targeted shippers. So it really wasn't on anybody's radar. Everybody was concentrating on straight theft. And these small regional crews, they were pretty easy to track. We knew their names. We knew who operated them. They weren't very, very complex in what they did. Uh, Intel exchanges with law enforcement and other, professionals like myself in the industry were pretty frequent, pretty easy. There wasn't much in the way of creativity, let's put it that way, among the thieves. But in 2020, we saw that change drastically. With everybody learning to work remotely, I think the thieves saw an opportunity that, hey, we can be anonymous, we can be remote, we can be, involved in the supply chain over a phone, over email, things like that. We don't have to be face to face with people. And they decided to start creating new methods for strategic theft. So between 2021 and 2024, cargo theft in the United States went international. These small regional crews, while they still exist, they're kind of on the peripheral at this point, right? The ones that everybody's really worried about are these big international organized rings, and they're operating from over 24 different countries. And it makes it very difficult. They've really been very creative about how they conduct strategic cargo theft, and it's gone from those two basic methods that I mentioned earlier to anywhere between 25 and 30 different methods in that strategic theft category. And according to CargoNet, we know cargo theft between 21 and 24 went up a total of 93%, but the largest category increase was in strategic theft, which saw a 1,475% increase. Cargo theft overall is at record numbers. It has, continuing to use the CargoNet numbers, it has leveled off, but it's leveled off at record highs. So we're in a spot now where we have record high cargo theft, and we have 25 or 30 different methods, which are very confusing to the industry. And so it's become much more sophisticated. It's become more complex. They're operating remotely. You make law enforcement does a great job making arrests on the ground here for what I would call, the foot soldiers, so to speak, but the numbers don't come down. The numbers don't seem to subside at all because the head of the snake, so to speak, is overseas.
Thanks, Scott, for setting that foundation. That's a great segue into our next question. So with the loss estimates where they are and a little bit all over the map, as you mentioned, what makes cargo theft so hard to measure? And with the best available data available, what does that reliably tell us?
Yeah, this is among experts in this field. This has been a topic of conversation for a while. Quite some time ago, a number got thrown out. I'm not going to point the number towards any particular person or group or anything, but numbers got thrown out that cargo theft in the United States was 15 to 30 billion. But, experts like Chuck Forsyth, Keith Lewis, myself, and many others challenged that and said, okay, where's that coming from? Give us the science behind that data and that number. And nobody could ever produce it. And so it was quickly discredited. And unfortunately, we see it get repeated every once in a while by different people or organizations. And, I always question the motivation behind throwing random numbers out like that. But the bottom line is that I believe that those numbers came from the fact that there is no place to get that number, right? So people were trying to figure out, what is the impact? What is the overall financial number that you put to cargo theft? Now, when I introduced myself in the beginning, what I also needed to mention is I currently serve as the chairman for TAPA, the Transported Asset Protection Association. And right now, TAPA is actually in the process of choosing an educational institution to build a study for the industry that will give the true value of a cargo theft to the industry. And I think the industry badly needs that. So that'll be a tool that'll come out that I think will be fantastic for everybody, for TIA members, and it's going to be just released to the general public. It's trying to service the industry with that. The point being is that there is no way to currently measure it. The federal government doesn't track cargo theft. CargoNet has the most reliable data out there when you ask about the most reliable data. So if we use the CargoNet data and we just take the surface numbers, I think CargoNet's 2025 end of the year report said that they had taken in about 724 million in cargo theft, reported cargo theft. Keep in mind that not every theft that they get reported to them do they get a dollar figure on, right? So that's kind of a basement number. That's kind of like the floor of it, right? And now I always say that CargoNet gets about 1/10 of all full truckload cargo theft, but about 1/15 of all truckload cargo theft if you include pilferage. So if we just go by full truckload and we say, okay, they reported 724 million, multiply that by 10, and in my opinion, you have the floor of the basement number, right? Now, is that the true value of cargo theft? Certainly not. When you look at, I always use this example. If you have a load of gaming consoles stolen in November, right before the holidays, right? And let's say the value of that load on the just on the retail side is $400,000. Is the value of that $400,000, or do you include the fact that now you're not on the shelf during the holidays, right? Your competitors are going to get that business that you're not going to get because your product wasn't on the shelf. Do you have any brand damage? Games are all downloaded now when you buy the consoles, right? So now you lose out on all those game downloads that you're not getting because you didn't sell the consoles, and then you got the price to remanufacture, or the cost to remanufacture, reship, insurance claims, investigations, add all that in. That's what we aim to show in our study, is that it's not a dollar for dollar, it's 5-1 or 4-1 or 3-1 or something like that. So I think that's information yet to come, but I think you can make an educated guess by using the CargoNet data.
Thank you, Scott. With that, can you go further into breaking down straight theft versus strategic theft, and a little bit about why strategic theft has grown so quickly relative to the traditional theft that we've all seen for a long time now?
Sure. And I think this is a great question. I think the vernacular needs to be consistent across the industry, right? The industry's terminology around cargo theft 10 years ago was all over the place, right? We called strategic theft fictitious pickups, when a fictitious pickup is just one method, as I articulated earlier, right? And then we moved it to strategic theft to create a bucket for all those different types of cargo theft. The catchphrase of the time right now is freight fraud, really, right? And freight fraud is again, it's one method, right, that falls into that strategic theft category. It rolls off the tongue well, people like to use it, but it's actually not the correct language. And why is it important to have the language correct? Well, because when we're all trying to communicate together and we're trying to tell each other what's going on, or people like Chuck Forsythe, Keith Lewis, John Cannon, myself, Bobby Motley are going out and training law enforcement. We're training them on this vernacular, right? So then when people from the industry call them and use different language, it can be confusing. It's not going to help you make the reports and things like that. So I think consistency around this is critical. The TIA's been really good about trying to stay consistent with that, which I'm thankful for. The difference, straight theft is called straight theft because it's very straightforward. You're physically going out and you're stealing cargo. You're physically on site, whether it's drop lots, truck stops, you name it. You're going out physically, you're there, and you're stealing it. Strategic theft is when it begins with deception. How it goes after that doesn't really matter. If it begins with some form of deception, identity theft, double brokering, you name it, then tricking you into giving them the freight, then that falls into the strategic theft category. And then you have all the subcategories under that: identity theft, double brokering scams, fictitious pickups, MC fraud, all those things, right? So fraud is a subcategory. It's a valid category, but it falls into that bucket. What we've seen is an evolution to that massive increase in strategic theft, primarily because you can be anywhere and target freight anywhere. When you're looking at a heat map from CargoNet on straight theft, you're going to see that the hottest spots in the country are the traditional ones around the ports, right? Where you have large port cities, large port states that have large ports, big industrial areas, big economies, high population density, and arterial highways. Those are the commonalities that you find on a heat map for straight theft. When you get into and so that's because you have to physically be there. You have to be where the cargo is, and that's where the cargo is. When you get into strategic theft, now you're getting into, hey, I can just look on load boards. I can target freight where I know it's moving. I can know where the distribution centers are. I can look up what freight I want. I can be more precise about the freight that I'm trying to target. And I can target areas that are not traditionally known for cargo theft. And in doing so, the advantage I gain there is that people aren't on guard. If I target a load in Southern California and it's electronics, everybody's on guard. They're going to take extra precaution. But if I target a load, out of Cheyenne, Wyoming, how many people in Cheyenne, Wyoming are dealing with cargo theft on a daily basis? So it allows me to be more precise. I can be anywhere and target freight anywhere. I can be anonymous. I'm not putting myself in jeopardy of being arrested because I'm physically on location, right? And I can trick people who are not used to seeing cargo theft. So, and there's a lot more ingredients that go behind it there, but those are the big ones.
Thanks for that breakdown, Scott. And everyone, just a quick reminder here, please submit any questions or comments you might have. We have a few more questions before we take some audience questions. So with all of that outlined, Scott, if you're a freight broker hearing some of this stuff and you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed, can we now shift to talking about how, with freight brokers now on the front lines, what are some of the most common deception patterns you want them to recognize early?
That's one of the biggest changes, right? Is that this massive increase in strategic theft has targeted a portion of the supply chain that traditionally wasn't dealing with that much cargo theft. Strategic theft was about 3% prior to 2020. So they weren't seeing all that much of it. They were dealing with it kind of secondhand through the trucking companies that they hired, right? And they would have to get involved depending on how those thefts went down. But they weren't on the front line, as you put it. Overnight, freight brokers, intermediaries were thrown up into the front line of it and were probably the least prepared. And that's not being critical. It's just, that's the way things were, right? They didn't have to be as prepared because they weren't dealing with it as frequently. So I think as we move further into the strategic theft realm, what I will say is this space, the intermediary space, the freight broker space, seems to be responding pretty well, at least in the sense that they understand it's a problem. They recognize it. They recognize that they have to deal with it. And they're seeking resources. They're seeking methods. They're seeking ways to harden their part of the supply chain, vetting carriers better. So there's been a good response overall, right? But the bad guys continue to evolve. So we'll give a couple of examples, right? So, one of the things I tell freight brokers right now is it seems very basic and it seems unfortunate almost, but the minute a trucking company starts talking to you about, hey, we're having mechanical issues or we have a flat tire, or you can't take it for that anymore. You have to immediately start to treat it as a theft because those are delay tactics. And they're not trying to trick you into thinking that there's not a theft going on. They're trying to create a delay of 24, 48 or more hours before you report it as a theft, before people are trying to find them or find the freight, right? So they're just trying to put you off. So while, 2 out of every 10 times it could be a legitimate breakdown, unfortunately, in this environment, you can't treat it that way. You have to immediately start acting as though there's something wrong. You have to reach out to your resources. The other thing is we still see a lot of the most common mistakes across the industry. There's a lot of companies out there that are engaging different technology platforms, that they use for vetting. There's several popular ones out there. I'm not going to get into naming them, but there's several popular ones out there that the freight brokers are using to help vet carriers. Please recognize that you can't just jump to technology and think that that's going to solve all the problems, right? There is no silver bullet out there. And I say that to be fair to these vetting platforms, right? That people engage in these vetting platforms thinking that this is going to solve all our problems. And there's just nothing out there that's going to do that. And so you really have to put good process and procedures in place as a foundation, or the technology will fail you, right? The technology will ultimately fail you. I can go out and buy the most technologically advanced tool to have in my garage, but if I don't know how to use it, and I rely on that completely to do the job, it's never going to work, right? And so you have to make sure that that's just one tool in your toolbox. April 15th, 2025, the TAPA released the freight broker security requirements, right? And the TIA and TAPA have talked about these requirements. We put, we threw them by the TIA to get some feedback on them. Several members of the TIA participated in building those. Those standards create a good foundation of internal process around how you should look at evaluating carriers, right? And then adding some of that technology that we're talking about, those platforms, is also part of that process, but it's just a part of that process. So I think those are the two biggest things, is recognizing that, hey, the bad guys are very much so using delay tactics right now. And you just have to recognize that that's something you can't treat as you've always treated it. And then secondly, recognizing that technology is not the answer. You can't just jump into technology and think that that's going to fix your problem. You have to have good internal processes in place.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. Looks like we are getting some comments in. Rolando said amen to that. So thanks, Rolando, and thanks for all your comments, everyone. We do have one more question for you, Scott, before we then turn to the audience here. You mentioned earlier, I think it was in your first response, Scott, about intelligence exchanges. And looking ahead, what changes in reporting, enforcement, and the industry collaboration would most reduce theft? And what should organizations do now to make those new methods, work?
Yeah, I think, the Corca bill that the TIA and TAPA and the PCSC and several others have been so active, IANA and several others have been so active to try and help get through, would go a long way to accurately tracking cargo theft in the United States. We talk about this all the time. CargoNet does a great job of gathering data and bringing it to the industry, but they only get a sample size of it, right? In my opinion, if this Corca bill gets passed and it mandates tracking of cargo theft, giving the industry and the federal government and the state governments a more accurate picture of just how bad this is, will raise a lot of eyebrows, and that will, hopefully that creates a bit of a chain reaction, which then gets you more resources, right? Again, if the Corca bill passes, that'll be a federal task force that would be created. There would be federal prosecutors dedicated to it. And so the reality of really understanding the depth and the scope of the problem becomes a vehicle to get you more resources to fight cargo theft, and in essence, then reduce cargo theft. Now, I always say this, I'm a huge supporter of the Corca bill. I helped to write the language, the cargo theft language that's in there, right? But that's not going to solve cargo theft. I think a lot of people think, well, once we get this bill passed, we can all take a breath, and that's going to solve cargo theft. And it's just not, right? It's going to give us another tool, so to speak, right? I think the next thing is the supply chain needs to continue to create a culture around cargo theft and supply chain security. I talk about this often, that the supply chain decades ago decided, hey, safety has to be a priority, and there needs to be a culture around safety in the supply chain, and everybody in the supply chain embraced that. What we have to understand is that cargo thieves look for the gaps. That's what they're trying to do. They're just looking for the weak link in the chainmail, so to speak, right? And right now, the point of pickup is the weak link in the supply chain. That's where you see so much of the strategic theft happen, is at the point of pickup. And, we all understand how the supply chain works. I've been around it since I was 18. I started driving truck right out of high school. So I've been around it since I was a kid. Shippers drive the industry. Shippers work down to the freight brokers, and the freight brokers then work down to the carriers, right? And we're seeing more and more shippers engage in security protocols and process with the freight brokers because the freight brokers are asking them to. And that's the beginning of a culture. Now, we're only in the beginning of it. It needs to grow. We need to close that gap at the point of pickup. Shippers, more and more shippers need to get on board with that. And I'm not being critical of them. I think we're seeing that. We see that at the TAPA conferences. We see that in Intel meetings and gatherings. I went to the RELA conference. I saw shippers there that were being engaged with it, things like that. So I think we're seeing shippers do that. But when it becomes the norm, that will help create an entire culture of supply chain security from the shippers to the brokers to the carriers. There's always talk about we have to stay one step ahead of the cargo thieves. That's almost impossible because they see what we do. They see how we react, and then they create a new method, and then we have to react to that new method. You're kind of chasing an idea there. What we have to do is we have to harden the supply chain from end to end, from shippers to carriers. So we have to make it harder for them to penetrate anything that we're doing, and we have to close those gaps. And so I think those are the biggest impacts we can have.
Thank you, Scott. Great breakdown there about all the different aspects. You talked a little bit about Corca, Scott, and we did have a question about FMC. We had two questions actually about FMCSA. I'm going to get to the first one now. And thank you everyone for your comments and your discussion in the comments. We love to see that. The first question, Scott, is from Chris. He says, Scott, thanks for your leadership on this issue. What's one thing that the FMCSA could do right now to alleviate the problem?
I think there has to be some guardrails and better controls around the purchase and sale of MC numbers. They've definitely made some steps on vetting new MC number ownership, right? And I think that needs to continue to improve. They have made some steps in that. So kudos to them on some of those initial steps. And I think that they're going to go deeper on that, and that needs to continue to improve. But, when you look at one of the most common methods out there is, the bad guys purchase an MC number and all the data and information that goes with it. And that's where I really got the idea for the chameleon effect when I wrote that article for the TIA, right? Is that by doing that, they get to blend right into the supply chain. So it's hard to tell a good guy from a bad guy when they're willing to buy an MC number and legitimately haul freight for months to lull people into a sense of trust, and then suddenly flip a switch and decide that they're going to use that same MC number to steal. So I think the FMCSA really needs to engage with the industry and have some more control and enforcement around the purchase and the sale of MC numbers. I'm all for free market, meaning free capitalism. You want to sell your MC number, you've built a business and everything like that, you should be able to sell it. That's my personal opinion, right? But I think that sale should have to pass through the FMCSA to make sure that the person purchasing it is legit and has no nefarious intent. The people that are selling them are not the bad guys. It's the people that are buying them who are trying to convince people, hey, you've done a really good job building this company and building this business over the years, and we want to reward you for that. And they listen, a lot of the times they come to those purchases with sophisticated paperwork. It looks legit. They act like they're purchasing a business. So people don't understand what the nefarious intent is behind that purchase. So I think passing those purchases through the FMCSA and having to get them approved, I think would go a long way to stemming that MC fraud aspect in the strategic theft category.
Thanks for that breakdown, Scott. We did have a few comments about compromised inboxes. Jason, thanks for your comment. Jason mentioned, Scott, would you be able to share any insights with what you're hearing with these compromised inboxes? For example, while working with carriers that shipper might have a history with, but with carriers now being struggling with their own inboxes and email domains being compromised, or potential inside jobs. And then we did have another comment about a spike in email account takeover. Legit carriers' emails are being hacked and loads being accepted and deleted from the mailbox before legit carrier knows it was accepted on their behalf.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, something that 2 years ago, I was asked at a conference how often I was seeing something like this, and my answer at the time was infrequently, but, maybe once or twice a month, we're seeing it. As we sit here today, it's happening all day, every day. And again, this goes back to my comment in the beginning of the live stream of there's so many different methods out there, that the industry, trying to figure out where the next attack or attempt, so to speak, is going to come from is just baffling to the industry. It's so much for the freight brokers to try and get a grip on, and this is one of the key areas, right? So the bad guys are using a lot of social engineering emails, phishing emails, and you get somebody to click on something, it can take you to. There's so many different ways that this works. I can't come anywhere near to getting in all of them on this one session, right? But as an example, you click on something in an email, you get an email that says, the bad guys have sent out emails trying to make it look like they're the FMCSA, like they're popular load boards, things like that. So people will click on that to reset a password or regain access, and it will actually take them to a cloned load board or a cloned website. So it looks exactly like the website you think you're going to. Right now, you put your information in, they have access to your systems and they have access to your email. And to the person who's making the comment, what we're seeing more and more lately is they create an email address, Anthony at ABC Trucking, right? And they conduct business from that email, and they just keep deleting the email so it doesn't, nobody sees it, nobody catches it, right? And they'll book freight, and then they'll basically double broker and redirect the load, and have send a good guy out to go pick up the load, right? And here's a great topic to talk about with this. I say very often, sort of tongue in cheek, but sort of serious, and several of my fellow expert Dale Prax says this all the time, and Danielle Spinelli and Keith Lewis, and a lot of people are out there saying this, like, hey, I'll joke with them, for the love of God, stop posting all your solutions on LinkedIn, right? We can't keep telling the good guys what we're doing to block them. And one of the things that the industry was very vocal about is, hey, if you send ABC Trucking to go pick up a load, don't load XYZ Trucking, Mr. or Mrs. Shipper, right? Don't load XYZ Trucking if they say they're there on behalf of ABC Trucking. So what do the bad guys do? A buddy of mine broke down some intel for me where they took over an email, they created an email, they booked the load with the freight broker, and then they hired the trucking company whose email they had hacked to go pick up the load because that's who the shipper was expecting to see at the dock. And they sent that trucking company to go pick it up, and they redirected that trucking company. So that trucking company gets victimized twice. They have their email hacked, and then they're sent to pick up a load and redirected that load so it becomes a stolen load. They had no idea, obviously, but this is how the bad guys will react to the things that we post and the things that we try and openly tell each other not to do. That needs to remain in intel meetings or at conferences, even though I still think that sometimes they spy on us at conferences and things like that. But yeah, the email hacking, I refrain a little bit from the word hacking. I get comments all the time like, hey, we've been hacked. And then it really ends up being social engineering and phishing, depending on who you talk to, what expert you talk to in the cyber area, which I am not a cyber expert. Some will say, yeah, technically that's a hack, and others will say, no, that's not what we consider a hack. So, it really comes down to email phishing and social engineering are the tools that are being used every day.
Thanks for that breakdown, Scott. I think we're going to take this one last question from the audience. It kind of stems from what you were just outlining, Scott. But Jessica asks, do you have any suggestions for brokers when it comes to minimizing their risk of the driver being a bad actor when the carrier as a whole checks out fine and is legitimate? I mean, I think you just got into a little bit about that with internal systems.
Yeah, what's being referred to is there's a newer method that I kind of fished out over the last couple of months that I think I'm kind of right now calling it the Trojan driver method, so to speak, right? Because the industry likes to have good, catchy names of some of the methods, and I'm one of those, so I'm guilty of that too. But when you have some of these vetting platforms out there that do a good job sorting out the bad guys, or the people that have purchased the MC numbers in order to create um, a bad guy trucking company that looks good, they're being caught. It's being more, these platforms, these vetting companies are making it more difficult for the bad guys to get away with that. And so what I think we're seeing is the bad guys will have a member of their crew go and either get hired as an employee of a good guy trucking company, or get hired on as a contract carrier or contractor, subcontractor for a good guy trucking company. The method there is basically, hey, the good trucking company, right? Anthony's Trucking is a good company. They have a good reputation. They're going to pass through the vetting process. And I'm just a driver, and I get passed through that vetting process because I'm just a driver, because we're not vetting the drivers, we're vetting the carriers, right? And so now that bad guy is hauling for a good guy, and they're communicating with their crew, and they're talking about what loads they have, or what loads they have that day, or they're hauling that day. And when the crew decides, hey, yeah, that load you have today, that's the one we want, they tell that guy, okay, go park that load and we'll steal it. So the driver says, oh, I went home, or I parked at a truck stop, or I stopped here or there, or whatever, for whatever reason. And the crew then steals the load. It makes people think that it's a straight theft. A driver parks, one of the most common scenarios in straight theft: driver parks load, goes into a truck stop, goes home, goes visit family, whatever, right? And bad guy crew comes and steals the load. So now it appears as though it's a straight theft, when actually it's a strategic theft. So what are my suggestions for that? One of the easiest things to do if you're a freight broker is say, especially for high target loads, is say, hey, don't assign any drivers to my loads that haven't been employed with you for X number of months. You can set that date line, right? You can say 6 months, a year, something like that, for high target commodities. I don't use high value, I use high target, right? Food and beverage is the number one targeted commodity in the industry. It's not the highest value, right? So you have to go by high target. But that's just one simple solution, is setting a timeline of, hey, no new drivers assigned to our high target loads, right? Justin Olson, who works here with me, always preaches about, you have to be very careful about, what control are you taking over the driver as an intermediary. So you can't really vet, how, you'd have to talk to your attorney. You have to talk to an attorney or a legal expert, which I'm not, Justin is, about how much control you can take over vetting a driver. But you don't have to necessarily vet a driver. You can just put qualifications over which drivers you want assigned to your load, meaning somebody who's been employed with you for over a year or over 6 months or something like that. And no, you can say, no subcontractors that have been under contract with you less than X period of time, things like that.
Thanks, Scott. That is a great wrap up to the discussion today. Every time we have one of these, Scott, I think, I know I learn a lot, and there's unfortunately another, method out there of strategic theft. Everyone, we will say, when we have these webinar or these live streams with Scott, be sure to follow up, check out what we have to offer, and let us know if you have any questions, whether that's emailing TIA or reaching out to Scott or your internal systems. Please, wherever we can help. If you're a TIA member and want to learn more, Scott is here to help along with the TIA. Scott, with that, where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you mentioned here today, and where, if they want to see you soon, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm going to be, so you can email me. It's scott@logistic with a Q on the end.com. You can see it up there in the background, right? Or I will be at the TIA Capital Ideas Conference in April. I'll be speaking at a couple of different things that I post on LinkedIn, so you can find my profile on LinkedIn as well and reach out to me there. Always happy to help as much as I can. I do get a lot of calls and emails and inquiries. I try and get back to everybody as much as I can. Again, I'll praise the TIA. You can reach out to the TIA and get in touch with me through the TIA. And we have several members on the TIA Cargo Theft Task Force that are helping members and answer questions for members, and can give resources and lead you in the right direction. So I think we all try and do our part, and I'm always happy to do what I can.
Thank you, Scott. We appreciate your leadership here. We love working with you. And again, everyone, be sure to follow the TIA LinkedIn and the YouTube channel for upcoming live streams, such as these ones with Scott talking about strategic cargo theft. But also check out tianet.org to check out some of the resources we talked about today. And stay tuned for the next live stream, the same time, same place next week, and here on out. But with that, Scott, I will let you get back to fighting the bad guys. And we appreciate it, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks Anthony.
Everyone.
Appreciate you. Take care.
Thanks, Scott. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.